Tonight's stories aren't about campfire legends. These are real experiences, dreams that predict deaths, little girls who stand outside the shower, dolls that move, and houses that call your name in your parents' voices. As you listen, ask yourself if your own dream warned you about someone dying. Would you believe it or ignore it and hope you're wrong? Story 1. I was 14 years old when this happened, back in 2007, and even now, years later, it still sits in the back of my mind like something I was never meant to understand. I've told this story a few times, and I always start the same way. I don't expect people to believe me. Honestly, I don't even fully believe it myself. What makes it harder is that both my parents remember it too, and even my dad, who has never believed in anything paranormal, was shaken by it. And that's the part that unsettles me the most. At that age, I was a pretty logical kid. I didn't believe in psychics or dreams having meaning beyond random imagination. To me, dreams were just noise, your brain sorting things out while you slept. I used to laugh at the idea that they could predict anything. Even now, I still think most of that stuff is nonsense. But what happened that night didn't feel like nonsense. It felt different from the start, like it carried weight in a way I had never experienced before. That night started like any other. Nothing unusual had happened during the day. No stress, no strange conversations, no reason for my mind to wander into dark places. I went to bed normally, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But sometime during the night, I had a dream that felt so real, so vivid, that even now I can remember pieces of it clearly. In the dream, my dog, Frisco, died. He wasn't just a pet to me, he was my best friend. The kind of dog that followed you everywhere, that understood your moods better than most people did. In the dream, there wasn't some dramatic event or accident, he just died. No warning, no explanation. One moment he was there, and the next he wasn't. I remember holding his ashes in my hands, feeling this overwhelming grief that didn't feel like a dream at all. It felt heavy, real, like something had actually been taken from me. Before I could even process that, the dream shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about my dog anymore. It was about my great uncle, someone who meant a lot to me, someone I looked up to like a grandfather. In the dream, he died too, but in a much more violent way. And there was blood, an insane amount of it, and at the time, my mind interpreted it as him being shot. It didn't make complete sense, but dreams rarely do. What mattered was the feeling, shock, confusion, and this deep sense that something terrible had happened. Then I woke up. I didn't just wake up calmly like you do after a normal dream. I woke up crying, actually crying, like I had just lost something real. My chest hurt, my eyes were wet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had just experienced wasn't just a dream. It was the first true night terror I had ever had. I remember going straight to my mum, panicked, barely able to form sentences, repeating over and over, "Frisco is dead. Frisco is dead." What happened to him? And the strangest part? Frisco wasn't dead. He walked right up to me, completely fine, was wagging his tail like nothing had happened. He comforted me in that simple way dogs do, like he could sense something was wrong. I remember feeling confused and relieved at the same time, trying to convince myself it was just a bad dream. My mom calmed me down, told me everything was okay, and eventually I tried to move on. For a few days, I managed to push it out of my mind. Life went back to normal. School, home, routine. It all felt the same again. But about a week later, something happened that brought the memory of that dream crashing back in a way I wasn't prepared for. My little sister was playing with Frisco when she suddenly said something was wrong. She had felt lumps on his legs. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Dogs get bumps sometimes, but there was something about the way she said it that made everyone uneasy. We took him to the vet, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, we got a diagnosis that none of us were ready for. Lymphoma. I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, but I understood enough to know it was serious. That feeling from the dream, the one I had tried to ignore, came rushing back. It sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. Over the next couple of months, we watched him decline. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic. It was slow, painful, and real. He was diagnosed in February. He died on April 13th. And just like in the dream, there wasn't some big moment. He was just gone. Losing him hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just sadness. It was this strange mix of grief and confusion, because part of me felt like I had already experienced it, like I had been there before. I tried to ignore that thought, telling myself it was coincidence, that my brain was just connecting things after the fact. That's what I still tried to believe. But it didn't end there. About a week after Frisco passed, while I was still trying to process everything, we got a phone call. I remember the atmosphere in the room changing instantly, like something had shifted. My mom's face told me everything before she even said a word. My great-uncle had passed away. The cause of death wasn't exactly what I had seen in the dream, but it was close enough to make my stomach drop. He had choked on his own blood in his sleep. There had been a severe internal issue, something that caused a large amount of blood loss. When I heard that, my mind immediately went back to the dream. The blood, the shock, the suddenness of it all. I remember just sitting there, trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. I wanted to explain it away, to find some logical reason why my brain had put those images together before they happened. But I couldn't. And that's what has stayed with me all these years. Not the fear, but the lack of explanation. Even now, I still try to rationalize it. I tell myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe I had picked up on subtle signs about my dog being sick without realizing it, that my brain created a worst-case scenario, and it just happened to line up with reality. As for my great-uncle, maybe it was just random chance. People die, sometimes close together, sometimes in ways that feel eerily similar to things we imagine. But then I think about how specific that dream felt, how real it felt, how it stayed with me so strongly that I woke up crying before anything had actually happened. And that's the part I can't fully explain. I've never had another dream like that. Not before, not after. Nothing that even comes close. It was a one-time thing, which somehow makes it even stranger. If it had happened multiple times, maybe I could label it as a pattern or some kind of psychological quirk. But just once, just that one night, followed by those events, it lingers. My mom still brings it up sometimes, like she's trying to understand it too. My dad doesn't talk about it much, but I know it affected him in a way he won't admit. And me? I've spent years trying to file it away under unexplained coincidence, because that's the only category that makes sense to me. But no matter how much I try to reason it out, there's always that small part of me that goes back to that night, back to being 14, waking up in tears, convinced something terrible had already happened, only to find out later that somehow it would. And that's the part I can never fully shake. Story 2. When I was younger, there was something in my life that I almost never talked about. Even now, I usually only mention it as a strange story when I'm getting to know someone well, like a girlfriend or a close friend. It always starts the same way. I tell them that when I was a kid, I used to see someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I used to see a little girl. Her name was Emily. The strange part was that she didn't appear everywhere. She didn't follow me around the house all day or pop up in random places like you would expect from a ghost story. For some reason, she almost always appeared in the same place. She stood just outside the shower. When I was very young, probably around 8 or 9, I started noticing her. At first I thought it was my imagination. Kids see things all the time. Shadows can look like people, and your brain can play tricks on you when you're alone or scared. But Emily was different. She was too clear, too consistent. She always looked the same. She was small, maybe about 3 feet tall. She wore a long, old dress that looked torn and worn out, like it had been dragged through dirt and time. Her hair was dark and messy, hanging straight down over her face. She had thick bangs that covered her eyes completely, so I could never actually see them. It was like she was hiding behind her own hair. And she never moved much. She would just stand there outside the shower and stare at me. If you've ever heard people joke about being scared in the shower, you probably know the usual idea. People say the scariest moment is when you close your eyes to rinse shampoo out of your hair. For a second, you can't see anything. Your mind starts imagining someone standing behind you when you open your eyes again. People laugh about it, but what I experienced felt very different. Because when I closed my eyes in the shower, I wasn't imagining someone. I already knew Emily was there. She never attacked me. She never screamed or jumped out or did anything dramatic like in horror movies. She simply stood there, silent, still, watching me. At first I tried to ignore her, but that didn't really work. Over time I started realizing something even stranger. Emily never spoke, but somehow she reacted to my thoughts. I know that sounds crazy, but that's exactly how it felt. If I thought something, if I asked a question in my head or responded to her presence mentally, something about her behavior would shift slightly. She didn't nod or move her lips, but I could feel that she understood. So eventually I started talking to her in my mind. I started setting rules. I had always been a kid with a very active imagination. My brain never stopped working. I could picture entire places and events in perfect detail, like a movie playing in my head. Because of that, I decided Emily couldn't just appear anywhere she wanted. If she was going to appear near me, I told her she had to follow certain rules. For example, if I was staying at my dad's house and she appeared there, then she couldn't instantly appear somewhere else when I traveled. If I went to my mum's house across town, she had to travel the same distance before she could appear again. I imagined her moving through the same roads and places I did, and if I went even farther away, like when my mum took me to northern Pennsylvania to visit family, I told her she had to travel that whole distance too. The strange part was that my mind made it possible. If I was 4 hours away from somewhere and standing in the shower, when I closed my eyes, my brain would replay the entire trip. Every road, every turn, every hill, every familiar landmark we had passed along the way. It was like watching a fast-forward version of the journey in my head. And then, right when the imagined trip ended, Emily would be there again. There was another part of my childhood that made things worse. My dad. My father could be funny sometimes. People outside our house probably thought he was a great guy. But inside the house, things were very different. He had a cruel side. He liked messing with people, and sometimes that turned into straight-up abuse. My stepmother was even worse. She seemed to enjoy making situations more stressful or scary. When I was about 9 years old, I made the mistake of telling them about Emily. I was a kid, and I thought maybe they would help me understand what was happening. Instead, they turned it into a game. Sometimes when I was in the bathroom getting ready to shower, my dad would suddenly shut off the power in the house by flipping the fuse. the lights would go completely dark. And at the same time, my stepmom would stand outside the door and whisper or chant my name in a creepy voice. They thought it was hilarious. They were trying to scare me, but what they didn't realize was something strange always happened during those moments. Whenever they started messing with me like that, Emily would disappear. It was like she didn't want anything to do with their cruelty. The moment they turned the situation into some kind of joke or torture, she was gone. That was one of the things that made me feel like whatever Emily was, it had something personal about it, something quiet and private. She never showed up when people were trying to force the situation. When I turned 12, things finally changed. After years of dealing with my father's behavior, I spoke up about what was happening. Eventually, I moved in with my mum full-time. Life improved a lot after that. My mum's house felt calmer, safer. I started focusing more on school, friends, and normal teenage stuff. I didn't tell anyone about Emily anymore. I kept that part of my life to myself. Interestingly, she appeared less often after I moved. She didn't vanish completely, but the sightings became rare. Weeks would pass without seeing her, sometimes even months. As time went on, I started feeling like maybe I had simply grown out of it. By the time I was 14, I was feeling pretty confident about life. I had friends, interests, and big ideas about the future. I had always loved inventing things and imagining new technology. I believed the world was full of possibilities. Emily barely crossed my mind anymore until one afternoon. I was home alone at my mum's house. No one else was around. I was 14 years old, wearing nothing but my underwear, blasting music and singing as loudly as possible. You know the kind of ridiculous freedom you feel when you're a teenager and the house is empty. I was walking through the hallway like a rock star when suddenly I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. A giggle. It was soft but clear. Without really thinking about it, I laughed and said out loud, "Okay, Emily, knock it off." I said it jokingly, like I was talking to an imaginary friend from childhood. Then I looked down the hallway. At first, I only saw the edge of a pale face slowly pulling back behind the corner of the bathroom wall. A thin strand of dark hair followed the movement. The second the face disappeared into the bathroom, my confidence vanished. Every hair on my body stood up. I didn't wait to investigate. I didn't even grab clothes. I ran straight out the front door in my underwear and onto the street. As luck would have it, my best friend was actually walking toward my house at that exact moment. He was the type of guy who loved horror movies and death metal music. Nothing scared him. I ran up to him, probably looking completely insane, and asked if I could use his phone. Back then, everyone didn't have a phone in their pocket like today, so borrowing his was the only way I could call my mum. When she answered, I started talking immediately. The words were flying out of my mouth as I told her about Emily appearing again in the hallway. Before I could finish explaining everything, my mom suddenly interrupted me. Her voice changed in a way I had never heard before. She said, describe her." I paused for a second and said, "She's small, maybe about 3 feet tall. She wears a torn dress." There was a brief silence on the phone. Then my mum asked another question. "Does she have dark hair that hangs over her eyes?" My stomach dropped. "Yeah," I said slowly. "That's her." "Why?" My mum took a breath before answering. And what she said next shocked me more than anything else that had happened. She told me that when she was a little girl, she used to see the exact same little girl. According to her, the girl would crawl out from underneath her bed late at night. She looked exactly the way I had described. Small, wearing an old dress, with dark hair covering her eyes. The girl wouldn't talk. She would just stare at her. And whenever my mom screamed for help, the girl would slowly crawl back under the bed and disappear. Hearing that story changed everything for me. My mum had been young when she had me, but she knew I cared a lot about my reputation and about being taken seriously. I've always tried to be a logical person, someone who invents things and looks at the world through reason. But my mum has always said the same thing. She will confirm this story any day. After that phone call, I didn't see Emily nearly as often. In fact, not long after that, I jokingly said something out loud one day when I was alone. I told her that if she left me alone, she was welcome to haunt my kids someday instead. I meant it as a joke. But strangely enough, I haven't seen Emily since. Story 3. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, something strange happened in our house that I still think about sometimes. It started with 2 porcelain dolls my dad brought home one evening. At the time, they looked beautiful, the kind of dolls you might see in a glass display case at a fancy store. They had delicate faces, carefully painted features, and old-fashioned dresses that made them look like they belonged in another time. I remember being excited when my dad first gave them to us. One doll was for me, and the other was for my mom. I don't remember exactly where he got them from. I just remember him walking through the door with a small box and saying he had found something special for us. My mom opened the tag on her doll and noticed something interesting. The doll had a little name tag attached to it, and the name written on it was the same name as her grandmother. That seemed like a sweet coincidence at the time. My mom smiled when she saw it and said it felt like a small connection to her family. None of us thought anything strange about it then. To us, they were just pretty dolls. We each placed them in our rooms. My dolls sat on top of a tall dresser in my bedroom. The dresser was about 6 feet high and stood against the back wall of my room. The dolls sat up there where it could easily be seen from almost anywhere in the room. My mom put her doll on top of a shorter dresser in her bedroom. Hers was about 4 feet tall and had a large mirror attached to the back. Looking back now, those placements probably didn't help the situation. Around that time in my life, I had just gotten my first laptop. It was the first time I had complete access to the internet whenever I wanted. That felt like a huge deal to me. I spent hours online every night talking to friends, watching videos, and discovering anime for the first time. My sleep schedule quickly became completely backwards. Instead of going to bed at a normal time, I would stay awake until 3 or 4 in the morning. Sometimes I didn't fall asleep until the sun was already coming up. Then I would sleep until noon or even later. My parents didn't really pay attention to my strange schedule as long as I wasn't causing trouble. Those late night hours were when everything started happening. Between midnight and 4 in the morning, when the house was completely quiet and everyone else was asleep, I started hearing strange sounds in my room. At first it was subtle. The noise sounded like those little rubber popper toys you sometimes see in stores. If you've ever played with one, you know the sound they make. You press them inside out and place them on a table, and after a moment they suddenly snap back into shape and pop into the air. The sound I kept hearing was almost identical to that. A small popping noise. Soft but very noticeable in the silence of the night. The first time I heard it, I assumed something in my room had fallen or shifted. Houses make noises sometimes. Wood creaks. Objects settle. I didn't think too much about it. But the sound kept happening. Night after night, I would hear it again. Sometimes once, sometimes several times in a row. Always late at night when the rest of the house was silent. Eventually, I started paying closer attention. I would stop whatever I was watching on my laptop and sit quietly, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. I checked around my desk. I checked under my bed. I even opened my closet to see if something inside had fallen over. Nothing ever explained it. The strange part was that the sound always seemed to come from somewhere near the back wall of my room, which was exactly where my dresser stood and exactly where the doll was sitting. I didn't want to jump to weird conclusions, so I tried to ignore the connection. But the more nights that passed, the harder it became not to think about it. Eventually I decided to bring my little brother into the room one night to see if he could hear it too. I figured if I was imagining things, he wouldn't notice anything. He came into my room and sat with me while I was on my laptop. For a while nothing happened. Then suddenly we both heard it. Pop. My brother looked at me immediately and said, "What was that?" I remember feeling a cold wave of relief and fear at the same time. Relief because I knew I wasn't imagining the sound. Fear because that meant something real was making it. We sat there quietly for a few minutes. Then it happened again. Pop. The sound was small but clear enough that we both turned our heads toward the back wall of the room. Neither of us could see anything moving. After that night, the sound kept coming back over the next few weeks. It never happened during the day, only late at night when I was awake alone. Eventually, the situation started to bother me enough that I mentioned it to one of my friends online. I was chatting with them while it was happening again. I told them about the popping noise and how it seemed to be coming from the area where my doll sat. My friend took it more seriously than I expected. They told me that if something strange was happening, I should try saying a prayer. They suggested grabbing a Bible, putting my hand and my brother's hand on it, and asking for protection. At that age, I didn't really know what I believed about things like that, but the situation had been bothering me enough that I was willing to try anything. There was only one problem. The Bible in our house was kept in a cabinet in the living room, which was on the other side of the house. My brother and I left my room and started walking down the hallway toward the living room. The house was dark and quiet, with only a small lamp glowing near the couch. We had made it about halfway through the living room when something happened that I will never forget. Both of us stopped walking at exactly the same time. We were staring toward the front of the room near the window. A small figure ran past the window. It looked like a little girl. She moved quickly, but clearly enough that we both saw the same thing. She ran across the room toward the window and then disappeared from sight. For a moment, neither of us said anything. What made it even more disturbing was what she was wearing. The dress looked exactly like the one my doll was wearing. The moment we realized that, we both panicked. We ran the rest of the way to the cabinet, grabbed the Bible as fast as we could, and ran back to my room. Once we were inside, we sat on the bed and did exactly what my friend had suggested. We placed our hands on the Bible and said a prayer, asking for whatever was causing the noises to leave us alone. Well, after that night, something interesting happened. The noises stopped. For about 3 months, the house was completely quiet again. No more popping sounds in the middle of the night. No strange feelings. Nothing unusual at all. For a while, I started thinking maybe the prayer had actually worked. But eventually, the sounds came back. Late one night, while I was once again awake on my laptop, I heard the familiar pop again from the back of my room. It was exactly the same as before. That wasn't the only strange thing connected to those dolls. My mom's doll always gave me a strange feeling too. Whenever I went into her room to grab laundry or look for something, I had the uncomfortable sensation that someone was watching me. You know that feeling you sometimes get when you walk into a room and it just feels off. Every time I looked toward the dresser where the doll sat, it felt like its eyes were following me. I know that sounds ridiculous, but the dolls' eyes were designed in a way that made them seem almost alive when the light hit them from certain angles. Even when I tried not to look directly at it, I could feel its presence behind me. To this day, even though the doll is long gone, I still don't like being in that room in the dark. Whenever I'm there, I turn on every light available just to feel comfortable. After the popping noises returned, my parents finally decided the dolls weren't worth keeping around. I don't remember the exact conversation that led to that decision, but I do remember the day they removed them from the house. Both dolls were taken away and gotten rid of. The strange thing is that the moment they were gone, the noises stopped again. Completely. No more popping sounds in the middle of the night. No more strange feelings in my room. The house went back to feeling normal. It has been years since then, and I still think about that time sometimes. Maybe there was some normal explanation for the noises that we never figured out. Maybe our imaginations were filling in the blanks. But there are two things I can't really explain. The first is that my brother heard the same sounds I did, and the second is that we both saw the same little girl run across the living room that night, dressed exactly like the doll sitting on my dresser. Story 4. I have lived in several houses during my life, and looking back now, 4 of them always gave me the same strange feeling. They all felt creepy in their own way, and I honestly believe that each one of them might have been haunted. Every house had something strange happen at one point or another. Some of the things were small and easy to ignore at first, but others were much harder to explain. Out of all of them, though, the third house we lived in is the one that scared me the most. Even now, years later, I still think about the things that happened there and wonder what exactly we were living with. I was in high school at the time. I had just moved in with my mom and my stepdad when I was 15 years old. My mom had married him only a few months before I moved in, so everything in my life already felt new and a little uncomfortable. I didn't know him very well yet, and I was still trying to adjust to living in a different house and being part of a new family situation. Or the house itself was small. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple place with a few rooms and thin walls. But from the beginning, there was something about it that didn't feel right to me. I couldn't explain it at the time. Sometimes houses just feel strange, especially when you're not used to them yet, so I tried not to think too much about it. The first thing that really stood out started happening in my bedroom. One night I was sitting in my room with the door closed. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, probably just listening to music or doing homework like any normal teenager. Suddenly, I noticed that the doorknob on my bedroom door was shaking. And when I say shaking, I don't mean a small movement. It was shaking hard, like someone on the other side of the door was trying to twist the handle and force it open. The strange thing was that my door was locked. At first, I tried to come up with a normal explanation. Where we lived, there were train tracks not too far away. Sometimes when trains passed, the ground would vibrate a little. So I told myself that maybe the shaking was just the vibration from a train going by. But the problem was that it didn't stop. The doorknob kept shaking again and again. It would stop for a moment and then start up again, and the movement was too strong to feel like a small vibration. It looked exactly like someone was grabbing the knob and trying to turn it. That was when another thought crossed my mind. Since I didn't know my stepdad very well yet, a small part of me wondered if maybe it was him messing with the door for some reason. Maybe he was checking if I had locked it. Or maybe he was trying to scare me as some kind of weird joke. I didn't really believe that he would do something like that, but at the same time I didn't know him well enough to completely rule it out. So the next night, I decided to test it. Instead of locking my bedroom door like I normally did, I left it unlocked. My thinking was simple. If someone was really trying to open the door from the outside, then this time the door would open. Later that night, the shaking started again. The doorknob began moving the same way it had the night before, twisting and rattling like someone was trying to force it open. But the door never opened. It just kept shaking. That was when I started to feel truly uncomfortable. If someone had been standing outside the door and turning the handle, the door would have opened easily since it wasn't locked. But it didn't. It just stayed closed while the handle continued to shake violently. After that night, it started happening more often. It didn't matter if it was day or night. It didn't matter if the door was locked or unlocked. Whenever I shut my bedroom door, sooner or later, the knob would start shaking. Sometimes it would happen while I was trying to sleep. Other times it would happen when I was just sitting in my room doing homework or watching TV. Each time it made the same sound and the same movement, like someone invisible was standing on the other side, trying to get in. I stopped trying to come up with explanations after a while. Nothing I thought of made sense. The house itself was small, so there wasn't really anywhere for someone to hide or sneak around without being noticed. If my mum or stepdad were walking through the hallway, I could usually hear them easily. But the strange things didn't stop with the doorknob. Ever since I was a kid, I've always had trouble sleeping. I'm the type of person who wakes up in the middle of the night or stays up later than everyone else in the house. Because of that, I would often get up late at night and walk into the kitchen to grab a snack or a drink. Many of the weird things happened during those quiet nights. The house would be completely silent. My mom and stepdad would both be asleep in their bedroom at the back of the house. The lights would be off, and the only sound would be the creaking of the floor when I walked. But sometimes, while I was walking through the hallway or standing in the kitchen, I would hear footsteps behind me. At first, I would think it was just the house settling or the floorboards making noise. Old houses do that sometimes, but the sounds were too clear for that. It sounded exactly like someone walking a few steps behind me. I would stop moving, and the footsteps would stop. When I started walking again, sometimes I would hear them again too. That alone was creepy enough, but there was something else that made it worse. Occasionally, while I was standing there, I would feel something tug on the bottom of my shirt. Not hard, just a small pull. The kind of tug a little kid might do if they were trying to get your attention. The first time it happened, I spun around immediately, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was never anyone behind me. The hallway would be empty. The kitchen would be empty. Or the whole house would be quiet and still. Those moments always left me standing there with my heart beating fast, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But deep down, it always felt like something had actually touched me. Even with all of those strange things happening, the two moments that scared me the most happened later. One of them happened early one winter morning. It was probably around 6 in the morning. During the winter, it was still completely dark outside at that time. I was sitting in the living room watching TV while getting ready for school. My stepdad was still asleep in his bedroom at the back of the house. My mom was getting ready to leave for work. I remember sitting there half awake, staring at the TV while eating something before school. The house felt quiet and normal for once. My mom walked to the front door to leave. Before she stepped outside, she turned around to say goodbye to me like she always did. She said something simple like, "Bye, have a good day." Right after she said it, both of us heard something that made the entire room feel cold. Clear as day, in a small child's voice, we heard someone say, "Goodbye." The voice sounded like it came from inside the house somewhere near us. It was unmistakably the voice of a little girl. My mum and I both froze. We slowly looked at each other at the exact same moment. I could see from her face that she had heard it just as clearly as I had. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I completely lost it and started screaming. My stepdad came running out of the back bedroom, asking what had happened. He looked confused and half asleep as he stood there in the hallway. My mom quickly told him what we had just heard. I still remember the way she reacted. After explaining it, she just shook her head, looked toward the door, and said something like, "Well, nope, I'm leaving. Bye." Then she walked out the door and went to work like nothing had happened. I stayed there shaken for a long time after that. But the final thing that happened at that house might have been the creepiest of all. One afternoon, our neighbor showed up at our house very angry. Our backyard connected to theirs, but their house was actually around the corner from ours. They came over and started yelling at my mum. The neighbor accused her of being a terrible parent for letting my little sister stay outside late at night playing on the swing. My mom looked completely confused. The reason was simple. My youngest sister didn't even live with us. She lived in another town with my dad at the time. The neighbor insisted that she had seen a little girl in our backyard multiple nights in a row. In our yard, there was a tree with a rope tied to one of the branches. It was basically a makeshift swing, but nobody in our family ever used it. According to the neighbor, whenever she went outside late at night to smoke, she would see a little girl sitting on that rope and swinging back and forth. She said the girl would laugh while she swung. The neighbor told my mum that she had seen it more than once. At first, she assumed it was my sister, which is why she was angry about a child being outside so late at night. But when my mom explained that my sister didn't even live there, the neighbor suddenly looked confused and uncomfortable. After that conversation, the story spread through our family. My aunt worked for the city and decided to look into the history of the property. She was curious about whether anything strange had happened there before we lived in the house. Eventually, she found something interesting. The house we were living in hadn't originally been built on that property. Years earlier, it had been moved from another location. It was also very old. Nobody ever figured out the full history of the house or who might have lived there before. But after hearing about the little girl's voice in the house and the neighbor seeing a child swinging in the backyard late at night, it definitely made us wonder. Maybe the house brought something with it when it was moved. Or maybe something had already been there waiting. I still don't know the answer. All I know is that during the time we lived there, it often felt like we weren't the only ones inside that house. And sometimes, especially late at night when everything was quiet, it felt like whatever was there was trying to get our attention. Story 5. One night something happened to me that I still can't explain, no matter how many times I go over it in my mind. It's one of those memories that feels strange every time you think about it. The moment itself didn't last very long, but the feeling it left behind stayed with me for a long time afterward. Even now, when I remember that night, I still wonder what exactly I saw in my room. At the time, I was living with my parents in a small apartment. It was a normal place, nothing special about it. Just a typical family apartment where everyone had their own routines. My room was pretty simple too. I had a futon instead of a regular bed, a small desk for my laptop, and not much else besides a few shelves and some personal stuff. The layout of the apartment was also very straightforward. My bedroom door opened directly toward a short corridor that led into the living room. My parents were very religious people, and in the living room they had a small setup with a Buddha statue and some red lights around it. At night those lights stayed on, which meant that even when everything else in the apartment was dark, there was always a faint red glow coming from the living room. That light would sometimes reflect softly along the hallway and faintly onto the walls near my bedroom door. It wasn't bright, but it was enough that you could still see shapes and outlines if your eyes adjusted to the darkness. The night this happened started out like any other normal night. It was late, probably sometime after midnight. I was lying in bed watching a show on my laptop. That was something I did all the time back then. I liked staying up late watching movies or TV shows with my headphones in while the rest of the apartment stayed quiet. The lights in my room were turned off. The only light in the room came from the screen of my laptop and the faint red glow drifting in from the living room. I had my earphones plugged in and the laptop power cord connected, since the battery on that laptop didn't work anymore. It would only stay on if it was plugged into the wall. If the cord came out, the laptop would instantly shut down. I was completely focused on the show I was watching. The episode was almost finished, and I was relaxed, lying there comfortably on my futon with the laptop resting beside me near the edge of the bed. Everything around me was very quiet. My parents were asleep in their room, and my brother wasn't even home yet that night. He had gone out earlier, so I knew for a fact he wasn't anywhere inside the apartment. I remember that moment very clearly because everything felt so normal. Then suddenly something happened that broke that quiet in the strangest way possible. Without any warning, the power cord connected to my laptop was violently ripped out from the side of my bed. It wasn't a small movement. It wasn't like the cord had slowly slipped out or been pulled slightly loose. It felt like something grabbed it and yanked it out with force, and the laptop instantly shut off because it had no battery. The screen went black right away. For a moment, I just sat there confused. My first reaction was that maybe the cord had gotten caught on something or slipped out somehow. But that didn't really make sense. The way it had been pulled felt strong and sudden, almost like someone had deliberately grabbed it. I don't have any pets, so there was no cat or dog that could have done it. And since I lived in an apartment with my parents, there was no way some random animal had wandered in. Still trying to figure out what happened, I slowly shut the laptop screen completely. That was when I noticed something that made my heart start racing. At the bottom end of my futon, near my feet, I could see what looked like the back of someone's head. It looked like a person crouching or sitting low at the end of my bed. For a second, my brain struggled to understand what I was seeing. I stared at it, trying to process it in the dim light. The faint red glow from the living room was just enough to outline the shape. It definitely looked like the back of someone's head. The shape was dark, like a silhouette, and it was positioned exactly where someone would be if they were crouching at the foot of my bed. My first thought was my brother, but that idea didn't make sense at all. He wasn't even home yet, and even if he had come back quietly, he wasn't the type to sneak into my room and play pranks like that. None of us in the family really did that kind of thing. I felt a mix of confusion and fear building up in my chest. My mind kept asking the same question again and again. Who was that? I slowly started to sit up and lean forward, trying to see the figure more clearly. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, and I wanted to get a better look. As soon as I moved slightly closer, the figure suddenly dropped down quickly. It was such a fast movement that it startled me. One moment the shape of the head was there at the edge of the bed, and the next moment it had vanished. It didn't move away normally. It dropped straight down, as if it had quickly ducked below my line of sight. My first reaction was to think it had hidden under the bed, but that was impossible. I slept on a futon that sat directly on the floor. There was no space underneath it for anyone to hide. That realization made the situation even more confusing. If it didn't hide under the bed, then where did it go? My bedroom door was open at the time, leading directly toward the short hallway and the living room beyond it. The faint red light from the Buddha statue still glowed softly from that direction. For a moment I wondered if whatever I had seen had crawled away into the living room. I sat there frozen on my bed, staring toward the corridor that led out of my room. The apartment was silent. The red glow from the living room was still faintly visible along the wall, just like it always was. I kept staring in that direction, trying to see if anything moved. Then something happened that made the situation even stranger. The faint red glow slowly disappeared. It didn't flicker or dim gradually like a light turning off normally. It was more like something had passed in front of it and blocked it out. The soft red reflection that had been visible along the wall suddenly vanished. For a few seconds I just sat there, completely frozen. My mind was racing with questions. If someone had walked through the living room, they could have blocked the light like that. But everyone in the apartment was supposed to be asleep, and I hadn't heard any footsteps. And even if someone had walked through the living room, that still didn't explain what I had seen at the foot of my bed just seconds earlier. The apartment remained quiet. Nothing else moved. No voices, no footsteps, no sounds at all. I stayed sitting there on my futon, staring toward the hallway for a long time, trying to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to get up and check the living room, but another part of me didn't really want to walk out there alone in the dark. Eventually, the silence started to feel normal again. Whatever had happened was over, and nothing else seemed to be moving around the apartment. After a while, I slowly leaned over and picked up the power cord that had been ripped from the laptop. I plugged it back in. The laptop turned on again, like nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought about the situation and almost laughed to myself. It felt so strange that after something that weird, the first thing I wanted to do was finish the episode I had been watching. But that's exactly what I did. I opened the laptop, restarted the show and watched the rest of it until the end. Even while I was watching, part of my mind kept thinking about what I'd seen earlier. I kept glancing toward the bottom of the bed and toward the hallway, half expecting something else to move. But nothing else happened that night. Eventually, after the show ended, I closed the laptop again and lay back down on the futon. Despite everything that had happened, I somehow managed to fall asleep. Looking back now, I still don't know what that figure at the end of my bed was supposed to be. I don't know what pulled the power cord from my laptop, or why the red glow from the living room disappeared for those few seconds. Maybe there's some explanation I never figured out. Or maybe there was something in that room with me that night that I simply couldn't see clearly enough to understand. All I know is that something interrupted my quiet night, pulled the power from my laptop, and then vanished just as quickly as it appeared. And somehow, after all of that, I still ended up finishing my show before going to sleep. Story 6. A few years ago, I had an experience that still sits in the back of my mind, something that occasionally comes back to me in dreams even now. It happened during what was supposed to be a completely ordinary walk through the woods. I enjoy being outdoors and exploring quiet places, especially areas that most people don't usually visit. There's something peaceful about walking away from crowded trails and finding your own path through nature. On that day, I had wandered a little further off the main track than usual. The path slowly faded until it was barely visible, and I was moving through thicker patches of trees and undergrowth. At first, everything felt normal. The air was calm, and the woods were quiet except for the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But after a while I noticed a strange smell drifting through the air. It was very strong and strangely sweet, At first I couldn't place it. It wasn't like the smell of flowers or plants. It was something heavier and more sickly, the kind of smell that sticks in the back of your nose. The deeper I walked into that part of the woods, the stronger the smell became. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the faint path completely and pushed through a thick patch of bushes and low branches, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. The undergrowth was dense enough that I had to use my hands to pull some of it aside. That's when I saw it. Hidden behind the bushes was a body. For a moment I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. My brain tried to interpret it as something else, maybe a pile of clothing or a fallen branch. But the longer I stared, the more obvious it became. It was a man. He had clearly been there for quite some time. His body was badly decomposed, swollen and discolored in ways that made it difficult to look at for more than a few seconds. His skin had turned strange shades of green and black, and there were signs that animals had already found him. The smell suddenly made perfect sense. I remember feeling frozen in place for a moment, trying to process what I had just discovered. Finding something like that in the middle of the woods is not something your mind is prepared for. The peaceful walk I had been enjoying just minutes earlier suddenly felt like it belonged to a completely different day. After the initial shock passed, I stepped back and pulled out my phone. I called the police and explained what I had found. The person on the other end of the phone asked a few questions about the location and what the body looked like. I tried to describe where I was as clearly as possible, but I had wandered pretty far from any obvious landmarks. They eventually told me officers were on the way, but because the area was remote, it might take some time for them to reach me. Then they asked me to wait there until they arrived. At the time, it made sense. If I had left the area, it might have been difficult for them to find the exact location again, so I agreed and stayed where I was. At first, I tried to keep some distance from the body. I stepped back onto a small, clear patch nearby and sat down against a tree, trying not to look in that direction too often. But time moves very slowly in situations like that. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The forest around me slowly became quieter as the day started fading into evening. The sunlight filtering through the trees turned dimmer and dimmer until the shadows grew long and the woods started to darken. Eventually, night began to settle in. Sitting there in the middle of the woods after dark was an entirely different experience from the peaceful walk I had started with earlier. The quiet felt heavier. Every small sound seemed louder. A twig snapping somewhere in the distance or the rustle of leaves would instantly grab my attention. And just a short distance away from me was the body. Even though I tried not to look in that direction, it was impossible to forget it was there. The smell still hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. Every once in a while the wind would shift and carry it directly toward me again. I kept checking my phone, hoping to see headlights or hear voices approaching through the trees. But for a long time nothing happened. I sat there alone in the darkness, with a dead man I had never met. Eventually the police did arrive. It took them quite a while to locate the exact spot, but when they finally reached the clearing, I felt a huge sense of relief. Flashlights cut through the darkness as they examined the area and began doing their work. They asked me questions about how I had found him and what time I had arrived. I explained everything as clearly as I could. Later I learned that the man had taken his own life. Hearing that made the whole situation feel even heavier. It meant he had come out there alone and chosen that quiet spot in the woods as his final place. For reasons I'll never understand, I happened to be the one who stumbled across him. For a long time after that day, the experience stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I started having strange dreams about him. In the dreams, I would see the same man from the woods, but he wasn't silent anymore. He would talk to me, and the things he said were never pleasant. In those dreams, he seemed angry that I had found him, like I had somehow disturbed a place where he wanted to remain hidden. Sometimes he would say disturbing things, telling me I shouldn't have interfered and that I should join him instead. When I woke up from those dreams, I always tried to remind myself that it was probably just my mind processing what had happened. Discovering something like that in real life is unsettling, and it's natural for your brain to replay it in strange ways afterward. Still, the dreams were unsettling at the time. Over the years, they became less frequent, but they never disappeared completely. Every once in a while, he still shows up in a dream, usually when I've been reminded of that day somehow. And even now, after telling the story again, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up appearing in my dreams tonight. Story 7. About 2 years ago, I had an experience during a late-night drive that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It happened after a family reunion that had taken place a couple of hours away from where I lived. Everyone else planned to stay the night, but I couldn't because I had work early the next morning. So after saying goodbye to everyone, I got back in my car and started the drive home. The trip was supposed to take around 2 hours. At first, everything felt normal. The roads were quiet and the night air was cool, the kind of calm that sometimes comes with long drives after a full day of socializing. I turned on some music and settled into the steady rhythm of the road. Most of the route took me through long stretches of countryside. On both sides of the road were thick bushes and tall trees that formed dark walls along the roadside. It was the kind of scenery that looks peaceful during the day, but can feel a little unsettling once the sun goes down. If you've ever seen those scenes in movies where a narrow road cuts through deep woods and the headlights are the only thing lighting the way, that's exactly what it looked like. For the first part of the drive, I felt fine. But after about 45 minutes, something changed. Out of nowhere, I started feeling extremely tired. It wasn't the gradual kind of tiredness where you slowly start to yawn more often. It hit suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. My eyes felt heavy and my focus started drifting. I tried opening the window for some cold air and turning the music up louder, hoping it would help me stay alert. But the tiredness didn't go away. I knew that continuing to drive while feeling like that was dangerous. I needed to pull over somewhere and rest for a little while, even if it was only for a short nap. The problem was that there weren't many safe places to stop. The road stretched on through trees and bushes with almost no parking areas, no gas stations, and no rest stops. Every once in a while, another car would pass in the opposite direction, but other than that, the road felt isolated. After a while, it became clear that I wasn't going to find a proper place to pull over anytime soon. My eyes kept wanting to close, and I could feel my concentration slipping. At that point, I decided to do something that, looking back, probably wasn't the smartest decision. I pulled my car off the road and onto a patch of grass just beyond the shoulder. There were bushes nearby, and I positioned the car behind them so it wouldn't be too visible from the road. My thinking at the time was that if someone drove past, they probably wouldn't even notice my car sitting there in the darkness. Before leaning back in the seat, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 11:22. I remember making a mental note of the time for some reason, maybe because I planned to only sleep for a short while. Then I closed my eyes. I must have fallen asleep almost immediately. The next thing I remember is being suddenly pulled out of sleep by a strange sound. It was a scratching noise. At first, I wasn't even fully awake. My brain was still foggy and trying to understand where I was. The scratching lasted only a few seconds before it stopped completely. I blinked and looked at the clock. 11:50. Only about half an hour had passed. Because the noise had stopped and I was still incredibly tired, I didn't bother looking around much. I assumed it might have been a small animal brushing against the car or something similar. I shrugged it off and closed my eyes again. Sleep came back quickly. The next time I woke up, it was because the same sound had returned. Scratch, scratch. This time it didn't stop right away. My eyes opened and I immediately checked the clock again. 12:40. Nearly an hour had passed since the first time I woke up. Now the scratching sound continued for several seconds longer than before, and it started to make me uneasy. My first thought was still that it could be an animal, maybe something curious walking around the car. But then another thought crept into my mind. Why would it come back almost an hour later? I slowly lifted my head and looked around the dark interior of the car. The trees outside blocked most of the moonlight, so everything beyond the windshield looked like shifting shadows. Then I glanced at the rearview mirror. For just a split second I saw something. A figure running away from the back of my car and disappearing into the trees. It moved quickly enough that I couldn't see any clear details, but it definitely looked human. My heart immediately started pounding. A ridiculous but terrifying thought flashed through my head. I remembered that old urban legend about the hook killer, the story where a killer scratches the side of a parked car and waits for someone to step out and investigate. In that moment, my brain latched onto that memory. There was no way I was stepping out of the car to check what was happening. Without wasting another second, I started the engine and pulled back onto the road as quickly as possible. I just wanted to get away from that dark stretch of trees and continue driving home. About 100 yards ahead, the road curved sharply around a bend. As I came around that corner, something else appeared that made the situation even stranger. There was a car parked on the side of the road. Its driver's side door was wide open. The vehicle sat there quietly in the darkness with no lights on and no movement around it. Instinctively, I slowed down slightly as I passed, glancing over to see if anyone was inside. The seat was empty. The car looked abandoned. A weird feeling settled in my stomach as I continued driving past it. Then I looked into my rearview mirror. At first I didn't see anything, but suddenly a man came sprinting around the corner behind me. He ran into the road, waving his arms and shouting. Even with the windows closed, I could hear him yelling, "Hey! Hey you!" He was running directly toward my car. Then he started screaming something that made the situation even more alarming. "Get out of your car! Now!" Everything in my body told me not to stop. I didn't know who he was, why he had been scratching my car earlier, or why his own vehicle was sitting there with the door open. But I knew one thing for sure. I had no intention of getting out of my car in the middle of a dark road with a stranger yelling at me. So I did the only thing that felt safe. I pressed the gas pedal and drove away as fast as I could. In the mirror, I could see the man shrinking into the distance as my car sped down the road. Eventually, he disappeared completely. I never saw him again. To this day, I still don't know what he was doing out there. Maybe he was stranded and desperate for help. Maybe he had been trying to scare someone into stopping, or maybe it was something even stranger. Whatever the explanation was, that experience taught me something important. If you're exhausted during a long drive, pulling over to rest is definitely the smart thing to do. But sleeping on the side of a dark, deserted road in the middle of nowhere, that's a decision I will never make again. You've heard about Emily at the shower door, dolls walking out of mirrors, footsteps crossing empty rooms, phantom phone calls, and something scratching inside a gun cabinet. Which kind of horror hits you harder? Objects that come to life or unseen things that know your name and your routine? Drop your answer in the comments while we keep going. Story 8. Last summer, I went back to my parents' house to spend some time there during the holidays. Even though I had moved out before that, I still visited them every now and then, especially during breaks when I had a few days free. Their house always felt familiar and comfortable to me because I had grown up there. I knew every hallway, every creak in the floor, and every room in the house. Normally when I stayed there, nothing unusual ever happened. Nights were quiet, and the house always had that calm feeling that family homes tend to have. But one night, something happened that both my sister and I still talk about because neither of us has ever been able to explain it. It was late at night, or technically early in the morning. I remember looking at the clock on my computer and seeing that it was around 3 in the morning. Everyone else in the house had gone to sleep hours earlier. I was the only one still awake. I had always been the type of person who stayed up late. Even when I was younger and still living at home, I would often be the last one awake in the house, usually sitting in my room watching videos, playing games, or browsing online. That night was no different. I was sitting in my room at my desk with my computer on. The lights in my room were dim, and the rest of the house was completely quiet. The hallway outside my room was dark, and there were no sounds coming from anywhere else in the house. My parents were asleep in their bedroom, and my sister was in her room just a short distance down the hall from mine. Our rooms were very close to each other. If either of us wanted to talk, we could easily just walk a few steps down the hallway and knock on the other person's door. That's why the phone call I received that night immediately felt strange. While I was sitting there at my computer, my phone suddenly started ringing. I picked it up and looked at the screen, and it showed that my sister was calling me. At first, I just stared at it for a second because it didn't make much sense. Her room was literally just down the hallway from mine. If she needed something or wanted to talk, she could have simply walked over and knocked on my door. Calling me on the phone from a few steps away felt unnecessary and a little weird. Still, I assumed there must be some reason she called. Maybe she didn't want to wake up our parents by walking through the hallway, or maybe she was just feeling lazy and decided to call instead. Whatever the reason was, it didn't seem like a big deal. So I reached over to answer the call, but the moment I touched the phone to pick it up, the call ended. The screen showed that the call had stopped before I could even say hello. I sat there for a second, confused. Maybe she had hung up by accident. Maybe she meant to call someone else and realized her mistake. Or maybe she had simply changed her mind and decided not to call after all. After thinking about it for a moment, I figured that she probably wanted to talk about something, but had accidentally ended the call. Since her room was so close, I decided to just go ask her what she needed. I got up from my chair and walked out of my room into the hallway. The house was still completely quiet. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floor as I walked. The hallway was dark, and the air had that still nighttime feeling that houses get when everyone is asleep. My sister's room was just a few steps away. As I walked toward her door, I was already thinking about how I would probably tease her for calling me when she could have just walked over. But before I even reached the door, something happened that immediately made my heart start racing. From inside her room, I suddenly heard her scream. It wasn't a normal yell or someone talking loudly. It was a full, terrified scream, the kind of scream someone makes when they are genuinely scared. I ran the last few steps to her door and pushed it open as fast as I could. When I burst into the room, I expected to see someone standing there or something obvious that had scared her. But the moment I looked around, I realized the room was completely empty except for her. My sister was sitting up in her bed, clearly shaken and crying. I quickly looked around the room again, checking every corner and every possible place someone could hide. But there was nothing there. No one was in the room besides her. I asked her what had happened, trying to calm her down while she caught her breath. It took a few minutes before she was able to explain anything because she was still crying and shaking. Eventually, she managed to tell me what had scared her. She said she had been asleep and suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. At first, she didn't know why she had woken up, but when she opened her eyes, she saw something that terrified her. Right in front of her face, only a few centimeters away, she saw a dark shadow. She described it as a shape hovering close to her face in the darkness. She couldn't clearly see what it was, only that it looked like a dark figure right next to her. The moment she saw it, she screamed. When she screamed, the shadow disappeared. Listening to her story made the whole situation even stranger for me, because that was when I told her something that confused her just as much. I told her that she had called me. She immediately looked at me and said that was impossible. According to her, she had been asleep the entire time until she woke up and saw the shadow. She said she never touched her phone and hadn't called anyone. I thought maybe she had forgotten, or maybe she had called me without realizing it. So I asked her where her phone was. She told me it wasn't even in her room. At that point, we both walked downstairs to check. Sure enough, her phone was sitting inside her purse downstairs in the living room. It had been there the entire night. She hadn't even brought it upstairs with her when she went to bed. That was when things became even more confusing. Even though her phone had never been in her room, I still had the call logged on my phone. My phone clearly showed that I had received a call from her number just minutes earlier, but when she checked her phone, there was no record of the call on her side at all. No outgoing call, no missed call, nothing. It was as if the call had only existed on my phone and nowhere else. We both stood there, staring at our phones, trying to figure out how that could even happen. Neither of us could think of any explanation that made sense. If she had called me, it should have appeared on her call history. But it didn't. And if she hadn't called me, then how did my phone receive a call from her number? The whole situation felt unsettling, especially because the timing lined up so perfectly with when she woke up and saw that shadow in her room. To this day, we've never been able to explain it. I still have the memory of that call showing up on my phone, ending just as I answered it, and then hearing my sister scream seconds later. Maybe it was some strange phone glitch. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Or maybe something else in the house wanted to make sure I went to her room at exactly that moment. Whatever the reason was, it's one of those experiences that still doesn't have a clear answer. And every time we talk about that night, it always leaves both of us wondering what really happened in that house at 3 a.m. Story 9. My grandmother told this story for the rest of her life, and she never once changed any part of it. She swore it happened exactly the way she described, right up until the day she died. Whenever the family talked about strange experiences or luck that felt too perfect to be coincidence, someone would eventually mention that night during the war. The story took place in London during World War II, when the city was being heavily bombed. At the time, my father was just a baby, and my grandmother was trying to survive the chaos like everyone else living there. Nights were especially tense because the bombing raids often happened after dark. People never knew when the air raid sirens would go off or where the next explosion would land. Life had become a routine of fear and survival. Families would rush into shelters when the sirens sounded, hoping their homes would still be standing by morning. Windows were covered and lights were kept low to avoid attracting enemy planes. Everyone lived with the constant understanding that any building could be destroyed without warning. One night, my grandmother's house was hit during one of the bombing raids. She didn't go into every detail when she told the story, but she always said the house had been bombed out. The damage was bad enough that she couldn't stay there anymore. With a baby to take care of and nowhere safe to sleep, she had to leave and find shelter somewhere else. Luckily, she had a friend in the city who offered to let her stay. Her friend lived in another house that had managed to survive the recent raids, and she welcomed my grandmother and the baby inside without hesitation. At that point in the war, people helped each other however they could. Everyone understood how easily they could end up in the same situation. The friend prepared a small room for my grandmother on the top floor of the house. It wasn't fancy, just a simple space with a bed and enough room to place a small cot for the baby. But compared to having no home at all, it was more than enough. That evening everything seemed quiet. There were no sirens yet, and the sky outside looked dark and calm. My grandmother spent the evening talking with her friend and trying to relax after the stress of losing her home. Eventually, it was time to put the baby to bed. She picked up my father, who was still very small, and began carrying him upstairs toward the room that had been prepared for them. The staircase leading to the top floor was narrow and creaked slightly as she climbed. Halfway up the stairs, something happened that she never forgot. She said that suddenly a figure appeared in front of her, not at the top of the stairs and not behind her. According to her, it simply materialized on the staircase itself, standing directly in her path. She described it as a person-shaped figure, but she could never clearly explain what it looked like beyond that. It wasn't someone she recognized. The figure spoke to her. It told her not to sleep in that room that night. The message was simple and direct. It didn't shout or threaten her, it just gave the warning. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. My grandmother said the moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to completely shake her. Whether it was fear, instinct, or something deeper, she didn't hesitate. She immediately turned around and went back downstairs. Her friend was surprised to see her returning so quickly, still holding the baby. My grandmother told her that she had changed her mind and didn't want to sleep upstairs after all. Instead, she said she would sleep in the sitting room downstairs with the baby. Her friend was a little annoyed at first. After all, she had gone through the trouble of preparing the upstairs room specifically for them. But eventually she agreed. There wasn't much point in arguing when someone felt uncomfortable, especially during such stressful times. So that night my grandmother and the baby slept in the sitting room. Sometime during the night, the bombing started again. The sound of distant explosions and aircraft filled the air, something that had become all too familiar to people living in London during that time. Our buildings shook as bombs fell across different parts of the city. Then, one explosion happened very close to the house. A bomb detonated nearby with enough force to severely damage the building. The blast caused part of the roof to collapse. The section that caved in was directly above the top floor room where my grandmother had originally planned to sleep with the baby. The debris crashed down through the ceiling and onto the small cot that had been prepared for my father. If they had been sleeping there that night, he would have been right underneath the falling rubble. My grandmother always said there was no doubt in her mind about what would have happened. A baby in a wooden cot beneath a collapsing roof would not have survived. But because she had gone downstairs instead, they were both safe in the sitting room, or whenever she told the story, she would pause at that moment and shake her head slightly, as if she still couldn't fully understand it, even decades later. She never claimed to know what the figure on the staircase was. She didn't say it was a ghost, an angel, or anything specific. She simply said that someone, or something, had warned her not to sleep in that room. And that warning saved my father's life. People who heard the story sometimes suggested that stress or exhaustion might have caused her to imagine the figure. After all, living through bombing raids and losing your home could push anyone to the edge. But my grandmother never doubted what she had seen. To her, the memory was as clear as any other moment in her life. She insisted that the figure had spoken to her, that she had heard the warning, and that she had trusted it. Oh, because of that decision, my father grew up, had a family of his own, and eventually told the story to us. And my grandmother continued telling it until the very end of her life, always with the same quiet certainty that something had been watching over them that night. Story 10. My mother told me this story not too long ago, even though the events themselves happened about 10 years earlier. When she first told it to me, it honestly left me feeling unsettled for quite a while. Our family has always been very practical and skeptical about anything paranormal, so hearing something like this coming from my own relatives made it feel even stranger. The story centers around my cousin, who died when she was very young. At the time she was around 17 or 18 years old. She had been in a serious car accident and was taken to the hospital. For a couple of weeks, the doctors tried everything they could to save her, but eventually she passed away from the injuries. Her death hit the family very hard. She had been a bright, kind person and was especially close with one of my dad's sisters, who we all called our aunt. They had always had a very strong bond. My cousin spent a lot of time at my aunt's house, especially helping out with the kids. My aunt had 2 small children at the time, both very young, no older than about 4. My cousin loved babysitting them and would come over often just to spend time with them. She played with them, helped watch them when my aunt needed to run errands, and was basically like an older sister to them. Because of that, she was a very familiar presence in that house. Around the time of her accident, my aunt's house was also going through some renovations. There was construction happening on different parts of the building, and workers were coming and going during the week to finish the project. Even after my cousin passed away, the construction continued. A few weeks after the funeral, my aunt went back to her normal routine. She returned to work and tried to move forward with life while the construction work at the house carried on during the daytime. One afternoon, while she was at work, she received a phone call from one of the construction workers. At first, she assumed the call was about something related to the renovation, maybe a question about the work or a problem that needed her approval before they continued. But the worker sounded frustrated. He told her that there was a teenage girl who kept showing up at the house while they were working. According to him, the girl had been seen walking around the property several times over the past couple of weeks. The workers thought it was strange because the house was clearly an active construction site, and normally people didn't just wander through areas like that. He said that she would appear suddenly, walk around the house or the yard for a while, and then leave again. At first they thought maybe she was a neighbor or a friend of the family, but she never spoke to them. She didn't approach them, ask questions, or interact with them at all. She would simply show up, walk around quietly, and then disappear. The worker said it had happened enough times that it was starting to bother them. And some of the crew had noticed her more than once, and they didn't understand why she kept coming back. That was why he had decided to call my aunt and ask about it. My aunt was confused when she heard this. She couldn't think of any teenage girl who would have a reason to be visiting the property repeatedly like that. So she asked the worker to describe the girl. The moment he began describing her, something about it made my aunt pause. He said the girl had long brown hair. He mentioned that she often wore a red baseball cap. Then he described the rest of her clothes, denim dungarees and a white jacket. As he continued talking, my aunt realized that the description matched someone she knew extremely well. It matched my cousin perfectly. Those were exactly the kinds of clothes she used to wear all the time. The red baseball cap in particular was something she had been known for wearing often, but the problem was obvious. My cousin had died weeks earlier. My aunt didn't say much during the phone call. She simply thanked the worker for letting her know and said she would talk to them when she got home. Later that day, when she arrived back at the house, the construction crew was still there finishing their work. She asked them again about the girl they had seen. Several of the workers repeated the same story. They all said that a teenage girl had been walking around the property multiple times during the past few weeks. Some of them had noticed her more than once. None of them knew who she was, and none of them had actually spoken to her. She would just quietly move around the yard or near the house, and then leave again. Finally, then my aunt went inside and brought out a photograph. It was a picture of my cousin. She showed the photo to the workers and asked them if the girl they had been seeing looked like the person in the picture. According to my mum, every one of them agreed immediately. They all said that the girl in the photograph was exactly the same person they had seen walking around the construction site. Hearing that completely shocked my aunt. There was no way any of them could have mistaken her for someone else from the neighborhood. The details they had described before even seeing the photo matched my cousin's appearance almost perfectly. The long brown hair, the red baseball cap, the denim overalls, the white jacket. Those were all things she had worn many times before. When my mom told me this story years later, it really unsettled me. Now, our family had never been the type to believe in ghost or paranormal stories. We had never had any strange experiences like that before. We were the kind of people who usually looked for logical explanations for things. But this situation was difficult to explain. The construction workers didn't know my cousin. They had never met her before, and they had no reason to make up a story like that. In fact, they were the ones who called my aunt first because they were confused about the girl wandering around the property. Yet the description they gave matched someone who had already passed away. Even now, whenever the story comes up in conversation, no one in the family can really explain it. Some people suggest maybe it was just a girl from the neighborhood who happened to look similar. Others think the workers might have misunderstood something, but part of me can't help wondering about another possibility. My cousin had loved that house and those kids more than almost anything. Maybe, just for a little while after she was gone, she came back to a place that had meant so much to her. Story 11. When I was in high school, one of my closest friends lived in an older neighborhood where most of the houses had been built decades earlier. They were the kind of homes with large porches, wooden trim, and big trees lining the streets. It was a quiet, nice part of town where nothing unusual really ever happened. Right next to his house, though, there was one place that always stood out. The house next door was constantly up for sale. For years, it seemed like people would move in, stay for a short while, and then suddenly disappear. Sometimes the house would sit empty for months. Other times, a new family would arrive, only for a moving truck to show up again not long afterward. What made it strange was how often people seemed to leave in the middle of the night. My friend said that more than once he had woken up to see lights on next door and a truck quietly being loaded, as if the owners were trying to leave without drawing attention. By morning, the house would be empty again. No one in the neighborhood ever seemed to talk about it directly, but everyone had noticed the pattern. For at least a couple of years, the house never kept the same owners for more than 6 months at a time. When we were teenagers, that kind of mystery only made the place more interesting. One night, my friend and I were hanging out at his house, bored like teenagers often are. We had already watched movies, played video games, and talked for hours. It was late, and neither of us felt like going to sleep yet. Eventually, my friend looked out the window toward the empty house next door and said something that immediately caught my attention. He suggested we go explore it. At the time, the house had been sitting empty again for a while. No lights, no cars, no signs that anyone had been living there recently. To a couple of bored high school kids, it felt like the perfect opportunity for a little adventure. We walked outside and went around to the back of the property, trying to stay quiet just in case anyone happened to notice us. Behind the house, there was a small dog door built into the back door. My friend was a little smaller than me, and after a moment of hesitation, he decided he could probably squeeze through it. He crouched down, pushed his way through the opening, and after a bit of awkward struggling, he managed to crawl inside. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of the back door unlocking. He opened it and let me in. The inside of the house was surprisingly ordinary. I had expected something creepy or run down, but it actually looked like a normal home that had simply been left empty. The layout and design made it obvious that it had probably been built sometime around the 1950s. It had that classic craftsman style that a lot of houses in that neighborhood shared. The walls were plain, the floors were wooden, and the rooms were simple but well built. We walked quietly through a few of the rooms, or shining small flashlights around and looking at everything out of curiosity. There was nothing broken or damaged. It almost looked like the last owners had packed their things and left in a hurry, but otherwise the house was still in good condition. Eventually we made our way into the kitchen. It was actually a really nice space. One thing that stood out immediately was a built-in breakfast table that had been constructed right into the wall beneath a large picture window. It looked like the kind of cozy spot where a family might sit in the mornings to eat breakfast while sunlight came through the glass. Of course, at that moment, there was no sunlight. The electricity in the house had been shut off, so the room was mostly dark. The only light came from a street lamp outside that shone faintly through the big window, casting a dim glow across the table and the floor. My friend and I sat down on the floor across from the table. Looking back, I have no idea why we did that. We were just teenagers messing around in an empty house, talking about random things and enjoying the strange quiet of the place. For a while, everything felt completely normal. Then, suddenly, my friend screamed. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to react. The instant he shouted, my vision went completely black, but it wasn't like closing your eyes or turning off a light. It felt different. My eyes were open, but it was as if something had swallowed all the light around me. At the same time, an intense cold spread through my entire body. It started at the top of my head and ran all the way down to my feet. The feeling was sickly and unnatural. Like every bit of warmth had been drained out of me in an instant. It wasn't just being cold the way you feel during winter. This felt deeper, heavier. The darkness and the cold surrounded me so suddenly that I started screaming without even realizing it. I couldn't see anything at all. My arms moved blindly in front of me as I tried to figure out what was happening. It felt like the entire world had disappeared around me. Then I felt someone grab my hand. It was my friend. He was pulling me hard, dragging me across the floor and towards some direction. I couldn't see where we were going, but he was moving fast and clearly trying to get us out of there. Slowly, my vision began to return. Shapes started forming again, shadows turning back into walls and doorways. The darkness faded little by little, and the terrible cold in my body began to ease. The next thing I knew, we were outside. We were standing under the street light in front of the house. The cold winter air hit my face, but strangely it felt warmer than what I had just experienced inside. It was December, and logically the inside of the house should have been warmer than standing outside in the middle of the night. But at that moment, the outside air felt like relief. I was breathing hard and still trying to understand what had just happened. When I finally looked over at my friend, I saw that he looked just as shaken as I felt. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked him what had happened. He hesitated before answering, like he wasn't sure how to even explain it. Finally, he told me what he had seen. According to him, while I had been sitting there talking, something had moved underneath the built-in table. He described it as a black shape, almost like a shadow, but with the vague outline of a girl. He said it crawled out slowly from beneath the table and then climbed on top of me. The moment it touched me was when I had suddenly gone quiet and started moving my hands around like I couldn't see anything. He said my eyes were wide open, but it looked like I was completely blind. That's when he panicked. He grabbed my hand and dragged me out of the house as fast as he could. We stood there for a long time under the streetlight, both trying to calm down. Eventually, we went back to his house without saying much else about it. Even now, years later, we still talk about that night sometimes. What's strange is that neither of our memories of it have ever changed. The details are always the same every time we bring it up, and I can still remember that feeling better than anything else. That strange darkness, that horrible cold. I've never felt anything like it before or since. For a few days afterward, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had been wrong in that house. Every time I thought about it, I felt that same chill run down my spine. After that night, I refused to ever walk past that house again. Even now, remembering it still makes me uncomfortable. Story 12. When I was in high school, one of my closest friends lived in an older neighborhood where most of the houses had been built decades earlier. They were the kind of homes with large porches, wooden trim, and big trees lining the streets. It was a quiet, a nice part of town where nothing unusual really ever happened. Right next to his house, though, there was one place that always stood out. The house next door was constantly up for sale. For years it seemed like people would move in, stay for a short while, and then suddenly disappear. Sometimes the house would sit empty for months. Other times, a new family would arrive, only for a moving truck to show up again not long afterward. What made it strange was how often people seemed to leave in the middle of the night. My friend said that more than once he had woken up to see lights on next door and a truck quietly being loaded, as if the owners were trying to leave without drawing attention. By morning, the house would be empty again. No one in the neighborhood ever seemed to talk about it directly, but everyone had noticed the pattern. For at least a couple of years, the house never kept the same owners for more than 6 months at a time. When we were teenagers, that kind of mystery only made the place more interesting. One night, my friend and I were hanging out at his house, bored like teenagers often are. We had already watched movies, played video games, and talked for hours. It was late, and neither of us felt like going to sleep yet. Eventually, my friend looked out of the window toward the empty house next door and said something that immediately caught my attention. He suggested we go explore it. At the time, the house had been sitting empty again for a while. No lights, no cars, no signs that anyone had been living there recently. To a couple of bored high school kids, it felt like the perfect opportunity for a little adventure. We walked outside and went around to the back of the property, trying to stay quiet just in case anyone happened to notice us. Behind the house, there was a small dog door built into the back door. My friend was a little smaller than me, and after a moment of hesitation, he decided he could probably squeeze through it. He crouched down, pushed his way through the opening, and after a bit of awkward struggling, he managed to crawl inside. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of the back door unlocking. He opened it and let me in. The inside of the house was surprisingly ordinary. I had expected something creepy or run down, but it actually looked like a normal home that had simply been left empty. The layout and design made it obvious that it had probably been built sometime around the 1950s. It had that classic craftsman style that a lot of houses in that neighborhood shared. The walls were plain, the floors were wooden, and the rooms were simple but well built. We walked quietly through a few of the rooms, shining small flashlights around and looking at everything out of curiosity. There was nothing broken or damaged. It almost looked like the last owners had packed their things and left in a hurry, but otherwise the house was still in good condition. Eventually, we made our way into the kitchen. It was actually a really nice space. One thing that stood out immediately was a built-in breakfast table that had been constructed right into the wall beneath a large picture window. It looked like the kind of cozy spot where a family might sit in the mornings to eat breakfast, while sunlight came through the glass. Of course, at that moment there was no sunlight. The electricity in the house had been shut off, so the room was mostly dark. The only light came from a street lamp outside that shone faintly through the big window, casting a dim glow across the table and the floor. My friend and I sat down on the floor across from the table. Looking back, I have no idea why we did that. We were just teenagers messing around in an empty house, talking about random things and enjoying the strange quiet of the place. For a while, everything felt completely normal. Then suddenly my friend screamed. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to react. The instant he shouted, my vision went completely black. But it wasn't like closing your eyes or turning off a light. It felt different. My eyes were open, but it was as if something had swallowed all the light around me. At the same time, an intense cold spread through my entire body. It started at the top of my head and ran all the way down to my feet. The feeling was sickly and unnatural, like every bit of warmth had been drained out of me in an instant. It wasn't just being cold the way you feel during winter. This felt deeper, heavier. The darkness and the cold surrounded me so suddenly that I started screaming without even realizing it. I couldn't see anything at all. My arms moved blindly in front of me as I tried to figure out what was happening. It felt like the entire world had disappeared around me. Then I felt someone grab my hand. It was my friend. He was pulling me hard, dragging me across the floor and towards some direction. I couldn't see where we were going, but he was moving fast and clearly trying to get us out of there. Slowly, my vision began to return. Shapes started forming again, shadows turning back into walls and doorways. The darkness faded little by little, and the terrible cold in my body began to ease. The next thing I knew, we were outside. We were standing under the streetlight in front of the house. The cold winter air hit my face, but strangely it felt warmer than what I had just experienced inside. It was December, and logically, The inside of the house should have been warmer than standing outside in the middle of the night. But at that moment the outside air felt like relief. I was breathing hard and still trying to understand what had just happened. When I finally looked over at my friend, I saw that he looked just as shaken as I felt. His face was pale and his eyes were wide. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked him what had happened. He hesitated before answering, like he wasn't sure how to even explain it. Finally, he told me what he had seen. According to him, while I had been sitting there talking, something had moved underneath the built-in table. He described it as a black shape, almost like a shadow, but with the vague outline of a girl. He said it crawled out slowly from beneath the table and then climbed on top of me. The moment it touched me was when I had suddenly gone quiet and started moving my hands around like I couldn't see anything. He said my eyes were wide open, but it looked like I was completely blind. That's when he panicked. He grabbed my hand and dragged me out of the house as fast as he could. We stood there for a long time under the streetlight, both trying to calm down. Eventually we went back to his house without saying much else about it. Even now, years later, we still talk about that night sometimes. What's strange is that neither of our memories of it have ever changed. The details are always the same every time we bring it up, and I can still remember that feeling better than anything else, that strange darkness, that horrible cold. I've never felt anything like it before or since. For a few days afterward, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had been wrong in that house. Every time I thought about it, I felt that same chill run down my spine. After that night, I refused to ever walk past that house again. Even now, remembering it still makes me uncomfortable. Is story 13. Every time I stay at my grandparents' house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It always sounds the same. The footsteps start at one side of the room above me, move slowly across the floor at a casual pace, and then stop at the other side. The whole thing takes maybe 10 seconds. Then the house goes quiet again. On most nights it happens once or twice. The strange thing is that I never heard it when I was younger. It only started when I was about 14 years old. That was the year my grandparents changed their sleeping arrangements and began using separate bedrooms. Because of that, they moved me into a different room whenever I stayed over. Instead of the guest room I used before, they started having me sleep in a bedroom on the first floor. Both of their rooms were also on the first floor, which meant that the entire upstairs was empty at night. Even before that change, I'd always been uneasy about the upstairs of their house. I can't explain exactly why. Nothing bad had ever happened there, and no one had ever tried to scare me about it when I was little. But something about that part of the house always made me uncomfortable. Even now, I'm 23 years old, and I still refuse to go up there by myself. There is one room in particular that always bothered me the most. It's a long, narrow bedroom at the end of the hallway upstairs. The layout of the room is a little unusual. When you open the door, there are 2 closets immediately on either side of you, one to the left and one to the right. A bed sits roughly in the middle of the room, and at the far end there's a single window facing outside. As a kid, I had heard a strange story about that room. My grandparents once told me that the sons of the previous owner claimed they had seen something there when they were younger. According to them, they would sometimes wake up at night and see what they described as a gorilla coming out of one of the closets. They said it would step into the room, dance around for a while, and then go back into the closet. At the time, I didn't really take the story seriously. It sounded like the kind of weird thing kids imagine when they're half asleep. I mostly forgot about it as I got older. That was until I started sleeping in the room downstairs. The bedroom my grandparents gave me was located directly below that narrow room upstairs. The first night I stayed there after the change, everything seemed normal at first. We all went to bed around the same time. The lights in the house were turned off, and soon the whole place was quiet. I was still awake, lying in bed and staring into the darkness. Then I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. At first I wasn't sure what it was. The sound was slow and steady, like someone walking calmly across the floor above me. It started at one end of the room upstairs. Each step moved closer and closer to where I was lying in bed below. I could actually track the movement as it crossed directly above me. Then the footsteps continued to the far side of the room and stopped. I lay there completely still, wide awake. There was no doubt in my mind about what I had heard. It sounded exactly like footsteps, not running, not stumbling, just someone walking slowly and casually across the floor. I was terrified. After a few seconds, I got out of bed and walked down the hall to my grandpa's room. I knocked and told him what I had heard upstairs. He didn't seem concerned. He told me the house was old and that old houses make a lot of creaking noises at night. According to him, it was probably just the wood settling or expanding. Even though he didn't believe me, he did turn on the dining room light so that the hallway outside my room wouldn't be completely dark. That small bit of light made me feel a little safer, so I went back to bed. For a while, everything was quiet again. Then the sound started a second time. This time, the footsteps began at the opposite side of the room upstairs, near the window. It was exactly where the sound had stopped the first time. Once again, the steps moved slowly across the floor. Once again, they passed directly over me. And once again, they stopped near the door of that room upstairs. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. For a few seconds, the house went silent again. Then I heard something that made the situation even worse. Footsteps on the stairs. The staircase in my grandparents' house is old and wooden, and every step makes a very distinct sound when someone walks on it. As I lay there frozen in bed, I heard each step clearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then silence for a moment as the person, or whatever it was, reached the landing halfway down. Then the footsteps continued. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then silence again as the sound reached the first floor. At that moment, I felt completely paralyzed with fear. Whatever had been walking upstairs was now on the same floor as me. The dining room light was still on, and the faint glow was shining through the doorway of my bedroom. I stared at that doorway, waiting to see if something would appear. Instead, something strange started happening to my vision. The light from the hallway seemed to bend and blur. My head felt dizzy, like the fear itself was making the room spin slightly. Panicking, I pulled the blankets over my head. That's when I heard another sound, a scratching noise, and it was coming from inside my room. Even worse, I knew exactly where it was coming from. My grandpa kept a wooden gun case in that room. It stood against the wall, not far from the bed. The scratching sound was clearly coming from the front of that case. It sounded like something dragging long nails slowly down the wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Each time it happened, I could hear the gun case door shift slightly in its frame, tapping faintly as the scratching started. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat felt tight and frozen, like my body wouldn't let me make a sound. After a few seconds, I forced myself to take a deep breath and finally managed to shout as loudly as I could. Within seconds, my grandpa rushed into the room. The scratching stopped immediately. I was shaking with fear, but I was incredibly relieved to see him standing there. Unfortunately, he still didn't believe anything strange had happened. He assumed I had just scared myself after hearing the house creak. After he left the room, I decided to do the only thing that made sense to me at the time. I pulled a sheet off the bed and draped it down the side so it hung all the way to the floor. And then I crawled underneath the bed itself. I wrapped myself tightly in a comforter, put headphones over my ears, and turned my back toward the door. My thinking was simple. If something was in the room, I didn't want to see it. For the rest of the night I stayed there, hidden under the bed. The next morning my grandpa told my grandma what had happened. She laughed it off at first, saying I had probably just scared myself. Then she said something that made the whole story even stranger. She mentioned that the last time my cousin stayed at the house, she had woken my grandma up in the middle of the night. My cousin had walked into her room and said the exact same thing I had. "I hear footsteps." After hearing that, I refused to sleep normally for the rest of that week. Every night I crawled under the bed again. Since then, I've stayed at my grandparents' house many times, and every single time I hear those footsteps upstairs. They always start at one side of the room, walk slowly across the floor, and stop at the other side. These days I sleep on top of the bed again, but I always turn my back to the door and put on headphones before trying to sleep. The footsteps still happen, but one thing has never happened again since that first night. I have never heard them come down the stairs, and honestly, if they ever do again, I don't think I want to know. Story 14. The house I grew up in looked like a normal family home from the outside. It was quiet, comfortable, and nothing about it seemed unusual when we first moved in. My parents were excited about it. My siblings and I had our own rooms, and everything felt like the start of a new chapter for our family. At the time, I was still pretty young, just a kid who spent most of the day playing with toys, watching TV, or wandering around the house. For the most part, life in that house felt normal. I went to school during the day, played with my siblings, and spent hours in my room building things with Legos or playing with whatever toys I had at the time. The house itself had a simple layout. My bedroom was at one end of the house, while my parents' room and the living room were on the other side. There was a hallway connecting everything, and the house was big enough that if someone called out from one end, the sound would travel clearly down the hall. Not long after we moved in, something strange started happening to me. At first, it seemed like something small and easy to ignore. I would be sitting in my room playing quietly when I suddenly heard someone call my name. The voice usually sounded like my dad. It would come from the opposite end of the house, near my parents' bedroom. The voice always sounded normal, like he was just calling me the way parents usually do when they want their kid to come help with something. So naturally, I would get up and go see what he wanted. I would walk down the hallway and go into my parents' room, expecting my dad to ask me to do a chore or help with something around the house. But every time I asked what he needed, both of my parents would look at me in confusion. They would say they hadn't called me. At first, I thought maybe they had simply forgotten or didn't realize they had called me. But it kept happening over and over again. Sometimes it would be my dad's voice. Other times it sounded more like my mom calling me. Every time I heard it, it sounded clear and real. And every time I went to check, my parents would insist they hadn't called my name at all. Because I was still a kid, I didn't immediately think anything creepy was happening. Instead, I started to believe that maybe my parents were playing some kind of joke on me. Kids often assume adults are teasing them, and that was the explanation that made the most sense to me at the time. The strange part was how often it happened. It wasn't just once or twice. It happened regularly, sometimes every couple of days. I would be in my room, building something with Legos, completely focused on what I was doing. and suddenly I would hear my name being called from down the hallway. The voice always sounded familiar, like one of my parents, and every single time when I went to check, they would say the same thing. "We didn't call you." Sometimes they even seemed a little confused about why I kept asking them that question. After a while, I stopped bringing it up as much because I assumed they were just messing with me. But there was one night when something happened that completely changed the way I thought about it. It was evening, and the house was quiet. I was in my room like usual, probably playing with Legos or some other toy that had my attention at the time. I remember sitting on the floor and building something while the rest of the house stayed calm and quiet. Then I heard my name again. This time it sounded like my dad calling me from my parents' room. Just like all the other times, the voice sounded clear and normal. Without thinking much about it, I got up and started walking down the hallway toward their room. At that point, I was used to this happening, so I expected the same thing that always happened. I would walk into the room, ask what they wanted, and they would say they hadn't called me. But something different happened that time. As soon as I stepped into their bedroom, I immediately saw both of my parents sitting there. They were right in front of me. At the exact same moment, I walked into the room. I heard another voice. This time, it was my mom's voice. But it wasn't coming from the room I was standing in. It was coming from the living room on the opposite side of the house. The voice clearly called my name from far down the hallway. That was the moment everything clicked in my mind. I was standing there looking directly at both of my parents, and neither of them had said anything. Yet I had just heard my mom's voice calling me from the other end of the house. I remember standing there, frozen for a second, suddenly realizing that nobody had been joking with me this whole time. If my parents were sitting right in front of me, then the voice I heard couldn't have been either of them. That realization scared me in a way I hadn't felt before. After that night, I stopped assuming it was a joke, but I also didn't really tell anyone about it for a long time. When you're a kid, sometimes you keep strange things to yourself because you're not sure how people will react. I didn't want my parents to think I was imagining things, and I didn't want to sound crazy. So I just quietly lived with it. Every once in a while, I would still hear someone call my name when nobody actually had. It didn't happen every day, but often enough that I noticed it. Eventually time passed, and life went on like normal. Years later, something happened in my family that made me think about those experiences again. My brother was diagnosed with partial narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a condition that affects sleep, and one of the symptoms people can experience is auditory hallucinations. That means hearing things that aren't actually there, like voices calling your name. When I heard about that symptom, I suddenly wondered if maybe the same thing had been happening to me. Maybe I had some kind of sleep disorder too. Maybe the voices I heard as a kid were simply hallucinations caused by something like narcolepsy. The idea made sense to me at the time, and it felt like a possible explanation for everything that had happened. So I decided to get myself checked by a doctor. I went through the tests and talked with medical professionals about the things I had experienced growing up. But after everything was done, the results came back completely normal. There was nothing wrong with me. No sleep disorder, no narcolepsy. Nothing that would explain hearing voices calling my name. That left me right back where I started. Even now, I still don't know what those voices were or why they sounded exactly like my parents. The strangest part is that the experience never completely stopped. Whenever I go back to visit my parents and stay overnight in that house, or sometimes late at night, I still hear it. Everything will be quiet, and then somewhere in the distance, I'll hear my name being called. It always sounds familiar, just like it did when I was a kid. And every time it happens, I pause and listen carefully, knowing that no one in the house actually called for me. After all these years, I still don't know what it is that keeps calling my name from the other end of that house. Story 15. When my sister was little, she had an imaginary friend. She described her as an older lady, gentle and kind, and she called her EE. For a while, my sister would talk to EE, play with her, and tell me stories about their time together. It seemed completely normal at the time. Then, around the age of 4, she stopped mentioning EE altogether. For a few years, the imaginary friend seemed to vanish. It's just a memory of early childhood play. Fast forward to when my sister was 10. One afternoon, our mom got an urgent call about our grandpa at the nursing home. She grabbed my dad and they left immediately, leaving my sister and me at home. At that time, my sister and I shared a room while I spent my time elsewhere in the house. The house was quiet for a while, just the usual sounds of day-to-day living. Suddenly, from across the house, I heard a strange sound coming from our shared room. The radio, which had been off all day, clicked on by itself. Its volume turned all the way up and then all the way down before it finally went silent. I thought maybe it was a fluke, but then it happened 2 more times in quick succession. Feeling a mix of curiosity and concern, I went into the room, ready to scold my sister for whatever prank she was pulling. When I entered, I found her sitting there, completely pale, almost like she had seen a ghost. She wasn't doing anything, she just looked terrified. I walked over to the radio, intending to unplug it, and that's when I realized something impossible. The radio had no batteries and wasn't plugged into any socket. It was just there, completely lifeless, and yet it had turned on and off on its own. I looked back at my sister, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and she whispered in a trembling voice, "It was EE, I saw her. It was EE." I was stunned, unsure what to do. I called our mom immediately, panic rising in my chest, and explained the situation. Mom's reaction was intense. She was upset and worried. Later, I found out why. Our grandpa had just passed away at the nursing home. The timing was uncanny, almost too precise to be mere coincidence. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. I didn't mention the incident to anyone else, choosing instead to try to brush it off as a weird coincidence. A few days later, at the funeral, something even stranger happened. A relative approached us and handed over a picture they had found. My sister, without hesitation, pointed at the photo and said, "Hey, it's EE." I looked at the picture more closely, trying to see what she meant. It was a photo of our grandparents on their wedding day. They were young and smiling, completely unaware of the years and hardships that awaited them. The most unsettling part was this. My grandmother had passed away long before I was even born, when my mom was just 11 years old. Our family home had been passed down, and we were living in the same house my mom had grown up in. By the time my step-grandmother moved in, she had removed almost all photographs of my mom's mother. There were no other pictures left in the house, no visual memories, nothing to remind us of her. Yet here was this photo, found by chance, or maybe not by chance, and my sister recognized EE immediately. I couldn't understand it. How could my 10-year-old sister, who had supposedly outgrown her imaginary friend, see EE appear again at exactly the moment of our grandpa's death? And how could she identify her from a photograph of my grandmother, a woman none of us had any real memories of? It felt like the boundaries between the living and the past had blurred for just a moment, and EE was somehow acting as a bridge between the worlds. Thinking back, the entire experience still haunts me. Even now I remember the look on my sister's face when she told me she had seen EE. The room had felt colder, heavier, like something unseen was present. The radio, turning on by itself with no power source, remains one of the strangest moments I have ever experienced. It wasn't playful, it wasn't mischievous. It was something else entirely, something that I still can't explain, even after all these years. Our family never talked much about it afterward. Mom seemed almost relieved that it had happened, almost as if it was a way of giving my sister a warning or a message. I never asked too many questions, but I noticed that my sister never mentioned EE again after that day. And yet, she remembered her clearly when she saw the photograph, a ghostly presence from her earliest years re-emerging at a moment of grief. Living in the same house where these events happened, I sometimes find myself looking at old corners and wondering if anything else from the past still lingers, just waiting for someone to notice. My sister and I grew up sharing that room, sharing memories that no one else could see, and occasionally it feels like EE might still be there, quietly watching over us. It's hard to explain and impossible to prove, but the sense of connection, of the past reaching into the present, has stayed with me ever since. Even the smallest details of that day stay in my mind. The sudden noise of the radio, the ghostly look on my sister's face, the absolute impossibility of the electronics working on their own. It's the kind of moment that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality. Maybe EE was just a figment of my sister's imagination, but maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was something else, something that appears only when it's most needed, something tied to memories, to family, to the past, in ways we cannot understand. Over the years, I've shared this story with friends, but most of them shrug it off, trying to rationalize it with science or coincidence. I understand their skepticism, and part of me wants to rationalize it too, but every time I remember that day and the look on my sister's face, I know that something extraordinary happened. And maybe that's what makes it real. The fear, the confusion, the undeniable sense of connection between our lives and the lives of those who came before us. Looking back, it also makes me reflect on childhood and how open we are to experiences that adults dismiss. My sister, just 10 years old at the time, had no reason to fabricate this. She wasn't seeking attention or trying to scare anyone. She simply saw what she saw, and she trusted what she saw. And in a world that constantly pushes us to doubt ourselves, that trust feels like a rare, fragile thing, almost sacred. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes wonder what my sister would have seen if we hadn't been in that exact moment, in that exact room when our grandpa passed. Would EE have appeared for someone else? Was it a one-time thing, a fleeting connection between the living and the dead? Or is EE still there, waiting for the right moment to show herself again? The photograph remains another strange piece of the puzzle. How could a child recognize an older lady she had imagined years ago in a photograph that none of us had ever seen before? Was it memory? Was it intuition? Or was it something far beyond our understanding? A thread connecting our families past and present in ways we cannot measure or define. Even though it has been years since that day, the story lives on in my mind. A constant reminder that life sometimes carries mysteries we cannot explain. Our family history, our home, the ghosts of those who came before us, all of it feels alive in that moment. And EE, my sister's imaginary friend turned messenger, remains one of the strangest, most unforgettable presences of my childhood. No matter how much time passes, I will never forget the terror and awe in my sister's eyes, the inexplicable movement of the radio, band the uncanny recognition of a photograph of someone she had never met. It's a story that refuses to be simple, that refuses to be explained, and maybe that's exactly why it stays with me. The past and the present collided in that small room, and for a brief, impossible moment, we glimpsed something that can't be named, something that is both terrifying and beautiful in its mystery. From wartime warnings on a staircase to cousins seen walking construction sites after death, from voices that sound like your parents to an imaginary grandmother named EE, these people are sure they didn't imagine it. Which single moment will you still be thinking about when you turn off the lights tonight? And if something like this happened to you, would you tell anyone or keep it to yourself? Tell me your story in the comments. And if you want more true horror like this, like the video and subscribe.